Imagine the sun hasn't broken through in 6 days. On the first day, you told yourself it would pass. By the third day, you stopped believing that. By the sixth day, you stopped counting the hours and started counting something else entirely. How much food is left? How much dry wood is left? How much patience is left? A single rainstorm is an inconvenience. A week of rain is a test. And for most of human history, it was a test that not everyone passed. Today, a week of rain means you reschedule things. You binge a show. You complain about your commute. For a human being 30,000 years ago, 6 or 7 straight days of rain meant the entire structure of survival had to change, because nothing you normally did to stay alive was available to you anymore. So what actually happened during those stretches? What did people do when the world outside simply stopped being usable for a week at a time? The first thing that broke down was food. A single bad day doesn't threaten a hunter-gatherer group much, because they typically keep a buffer, but a week changes the math completely. Rivers swell past their banks, game scatters into deep cover and stops moving predictably. Tracking becomes almost impossible because the ground turns to soup, and any print left behind fills with water within an hour. Foraging routes that were reliable become dangerous or simply gone. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham, known for his research into how cooking and fire shaped human evolution, has argued that early humans lived remarkably close to caloric margins, meaning even a few missed days of gathering could tip a group into real crisis. Now stretch that across a week. That's not hunger. That's the beginning of something far more serious. The second thing that broke down was the ground itself. Caves and rock shelters, the primary dwellings for tens of thousands of years, are frequently positioned near rivers or at the base of slopes, which is convenient for water access on a normal day and catastrophic during sustained rainfall. Days of continuous water saturate soil until it simply can't absorb anymore, and that's when flash floods happen, often with almost no warning. Archaeologists working at sites across South Africa and Europe have identified thick sediment layers inside caves that were deposited suddenly and violently, evidence that water surged into spaces where people were living. Some of those caves were abandoned afterward and never reoccupied. A week of rain doesn't just soak you. It can erase the ground you're standing on. And then there's the cold, which becomes more dangerous the longer it goes on, not less. A single wet night is uncomfortable. A week of intermittent soaking with no real chance to dry out clothing or bedding pushes the body toward a much darker outcome. Wet materials lose their insulating value almost entirely, and once your core temperature starts slipping on day 2 or 3, it doesn't reset overnight. It compounds. Layered on top of that is the predator problem, which gets worse the longer the rain continues because every animal in the region is looking for the same dry, defensible space you are. Cave sites in southern Africa have produced human remains alongside the remains of large cats, with skull damage that matches predator bite patterns almost exactly. A single storm might drive a leopard into shelter for a night. A week-long storm can trap a leopard and a family in the same space for days, and only one side wins that arrangement. So how did anyone survive a week of that? The answer starts, again, with fire. But a week changes what fire even means. A single night's fire needs feeding and shielding. A week's fire needs a system. It needs a designated person, sometimes rotating shifts of people, watching it constantly, because a fire that goes out on day 2 of a 7-day storm might not be relightable again until the storm ends. Rebecca Ragg Sykes, a Paleolithic archaeologist who has written extensively on Neanderthal behavior, has described fire maintenance not as a background task, but as one of the most cognitively demanding jobs a group performed, requiring constant judgment about fuel type, moisture, airflow, and timing. Over a week, that judgment gets tested constantly. Wood that seemed dry on day 1 is soaked by day 4. Overhangs that kept smoke clear on day 2 flood by day 5. Keeping a fire alive for a week isn't maintenance. It's a full-time occupation and probably was treated as one. With the fire secured, the same pattern shows up after any single storm, just amplified. People made things. But a week gives you time for projects that a single rainy afternoon never would. Lynn Wadley, an archaeologist whose excavations at Sibudu Cave in South Africa uncovered some of the oldest known bedding in the world, has pointed out that the sedge and rush sleeping mats found there weren't thrown together quickly. They were layered, replaced, and treated with insect-repelling plants over what appears to be extended periods of occupation, the kind of careful, repeated maintenance that only makes sense if people were staying in place for a long stretch. A week indoors isn't just enough time to make one tool. It's enough time to make one tool, test it, break it, and make a better version. This is where something interesting happens in the archaeological record. Short bursts of bad weather produce quick, functional tools. Extended bad weather produces refinement. Multiple examples of the same object, made with increasing skill, stacked in the same layer of sediment, is a pattern researchers associate with people who had time on their hands and used it to get better at something specific. Bone needles with steadily improving eye drilling technique. Stone blades that get thinner and more consistent across a single occupation layer. Cordage twisted from plant fiber that shows increasing uniformity in thickness and tension. None of that happens in a day. It happens across many days of forced repetition, which is exactly what a week of rain provides. Have you ever wondered why so much prehistoric art appears in clusters rather than as isolated single images? A single rainy day might produce one painting. A week might produce an entire panel. The cave art at Chauvet in southern France, dated to roughly 36,000 years ago, includes dozens of animals rendered with layered detail, shading, and even techniques that create a sense of motion when viewed by flickering firelight. Producing that kind of coordinated body of work, deep in total darkness using animal fat lamps that needed constant tending, is not a one-afternoon undertaking. It is the kind of output you'd expect from people with nowhere to go and days of forced stillness ahead of them, returning to the same wall session after session, refining what was already there. The same logic applies to what happened around the fire itself, and this is where the psychological weight of a week-long storm really shows up. A single evening of shared conversation is pleasant. 7 straight evenings with the same 15 to 30 people in the same confined space, with genuine anxiety about food and safety hanging over the group, is something else. It's pressure. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner, who studied firelight conversation patterns among the Juhwansi people of the Kalahari, found that nighttime storytelling served a specific social function, diffusing daytime tensions and reinforcing group cohesion through shared narrative. Extend that dynamic across a week of forced togetherness under real stress, and storytelling stops being entertainment. It becomes a pressure valve. It becomes the mechanism that keeps a stressed, hungry, cold group of people from turning on each other. That matters more than it might sound like at first. What happens to a group of people trapped together for a week with dwindling food and rising fear? Cooperation either strengthens or collapses. And the difference often comes down to shared understanding, meaning stories about who does what, who gets fed first, how resources get split, and why. Rain mythology exists in nearly every culture on Earth, and much of it isn't really about weather at all. It's about endurance, patience, and the reward that comes after suffering through something difficult together. Those aren't small themes. They're the exact themes a group would need reinforced during a week when everything outside the cave mouth looked like a threat. By day 4 or 5, something else tends to show up in the archaeological record. Evidence of resource stretching. Marrow extraction becomes more thorough, meaning bones show more intensive breakage patterns consistent with people working harder to get every last calorie from what they had. Plant remains show more diverse species being processed, suggesting people widened their diet to whatever was reachable near the shelter rather than what they preferred. This is the moment where knowledge sharing becomes critical rather than casual. Which roots are edible when nothing else is available? Which insects can be eaten raw versus which need cooking? Which stored food spoils fastest and needs to be used first? None of that is trivial information, and none of it gets passed down by accident. It gets passed down because someone sat by the fire on day 5 of a bad week and explained it to someone younger, because it might matter for their survival someday too. And then, eventually, the rain stops. This is the part that's easy to overlook, but it might be the most important part of the entire week. A week of rain doesn't just create hardship. It resets the landscape. Rivers that flooded leave behind fertile silt. Ground that was too hard to dig before is now soft enough for roots and tubers to be pulled easily. Mushrooms and fungi, which often need sustained moisture to fruit, appear in abundance right after long rains. And termite colonies in tropical regions swarm in extraordinary numbers once conditions dry slightly, offering a dense, easily collected source of protein exactly when a group's stores are lowest. Animals that scattered during the storm returned to predictable patterns within days, leaving fresh, deep, easily readable tracks in soft ground. A week of rain empties you out. The days right after refill you faster than almost any other point in the seasonal cycle. So a week of rain wasn't simply survived. It was, in a strange way, absorbed and converted. It emptied food stores and filled toolkits. It drained energy and produced art. It created real fear, and through that fear, produced the kind of shared storytelling that held groups together for generations. Every needle sharpened on day 3, every panel painted on day 5, every story refined and retold by the fire on day 6. All of it came from people who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do but make the most of the time they'd been given, whether they wanted it or not. Because here's the truth. A week-long storm reveals that a single rainy day never quite can. Endurance isn't really about waiting something out. It's about what you build while you wait. Imagine the sun hasn't broken through in 6 days, and somehow, that's exactly when the group became who they needed to be.